The train's headlights cut through the dense fog like a knife, slicing through the endless expanse of snow-covered wilderness. The engine roared as it barreled down the tracks, its rhythmic clattering echoing into the void of the frozen forest. The driver, a seasoned man named Henry, had made this route countless times before. He knew every twist, every turn, every creak of the tracks. But tonight, something felt off. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. Even the usual wildlife seemed to have vanished, leaving behind an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Henry tightened his grip on the controls, his breath visible in the cold cabin. He glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Just another hour until he reached the next station. He tried to shake the unease creeping into his mind, telling himself it was just the weather playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew better. This route was unpredictable, especially in winter. The forest had a way of reminding you who was really in charge. As the train rounded a sharp bend, Henry's heart skipped a beat. There, standing motionless on the tracks, was a wolf. Its fur was a stark white against the darkness, its eyes glowing like twin embers in the night. Henry's hand instinctively moved to the brake lever, but before he could react, the wolf darted off into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. He let out a shaky breath, his pulse racing. Wolves were rare in these parts, and seeing one so close to the tracks was unheard of. But the relief was short-lived. As the train continued forward, Henry noticed more shapes emerging from the shadows. Wolves. Dozens of them. They lined the edges of the forest, their eyes fixed on the train. Their presence was unnerving, but what truly sent a chill down Henry's spine was their behavior. They weren't hunting. They weren't stalking. They were waiting, watching, as if they were guarding something. Henry's mind raced. He had heard stories, of course. Old legends whispered by the locals about the wolves of the north. They spoke of a pack that roamed these woods, a pack unlike any other. They were said to be smarter, more cunning, almost supernatural. But Henry had always dismissed those tales as nothing more than folklore. Now he wasn't so sure. The train slowed as Henry approached a long, straight stretch of track. The wolves began to move, their movements synchronized, almost deliberate. They stepped onto the tracks, forming a solid wall of fur and teeth. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He had never seen anything like it. Wolves didn't behave this way. They didn't block trains. They didn't stand their ground against something so much larger than themselves. And yet, here they were, refusing to budge. Henry's hand hovered over the brake lever, his mind torn between stopping the train and trying to push through. But something held him back. A gut feeling, a primal instinct that told him this wasn't just a random act of animal behavior. There was a reason the wolves were here. A reason they were risking their lives to stop the train. As the train came to a halt, the wolves remained still, their eyes never leaving Henry. He could feel their gaze piercing through the glass, as if they were trying to communicate with him, to warn him. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft panting of the wolves and the faint creak of the train's engine. Henry's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. What were they protecting? What were they so desperate to keep him from seeing? Then he saw it. A faint glimmer of light in the distance, just beyond the tree line. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable against the backdrop of snow and shadows. But as Henry squinted, he realized it wasn't just a trick of the light. It was a fire, a small, flickering flame that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. And surrounding it were more wolves, their forms silhouetted against the glow. Henry's curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cabin, the cold air biting at his skin. The wolves didn't move as he approached, their eyes following his every step. He could feel their presence, like a physical force, pressing against him, urging him to turn back. But he couldn't. He had to know what was out there. As he drew closer to the fire, the wolves began to part, creating a narrow path for him to follow. Their behavior was so deliberate, so calculated, that it sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't just a pack of wild animals. This was something else entirely, something ancient, something powerful. The fire grew brighter as Henry approached, its warmth a stark contrast to the freezing air around him. And then he saw it. Nestled in the center of the flames was a small, wooden crate. It was old, its surface weathered and cracked, but it was intact. The wolves had formed a circle around it, their bodies tense, their eyes never leaving the crate. It was as if they were guarding it with their lives. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the crate. The wolves didn't stop him, but their growls grew louder, more menacing. He could feel their breath on his skin, their teeth inches from his flesh. But he couldn't stop. He had to know what was inside. With trembling hands, he lifted the lid. The inside of the crate was lined with faded velvet, and nestled within it was a single object, a pendant. It was unlike anything Henry had ever seen before. The metal was a deep, iridescent black, etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as the firelight danced across its surface. At its center was a gemstone, a deep blood-red color that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Henry reached for the pendant, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The moment he touched it, a jolt of energy surged through his body, so intense that it knocked him off his feet. The wolves howled in unison, their voices echoing through the forest like a mournful symphony. The fire roared to life, its flames licking at the sky, casting eerie shadows across the snow. Henry scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. The pendant felt heavy in his hand, its weight far greater than its size suggested. He could feel its power radiating through him, a primal force that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath his feet. The wolves were still now, their eyes fixed on him, their bodies tense. They were waiting, watching. But for what? As Henry clutched the pendant, a voice echoed in his mind. It was low and guttural, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It spoke in a language he didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. The pendant was not just an object. It was a key to something far greater, far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. The wolves began to move again, their movements slow and deliberate. They circled him, their eyes never leaving the pendant. Henry could feel their presence pressing in on him, their breath hot against his skin. He knew he had to make a choice. He could take the pendant and leave, but he had no idea what kind of power he was dealing with. Or he could leave it behind, let the wolves continue their vigil, and walk away. But something told him that wasn't an option. The pendant had chosen him, and now he was a part of something much larger than himself. As the wolves closed in, Henry made his decision. He slipped the pendant into his pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the power he now carried. The wolves howled again, their voices filled with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished into the shadows, leaving Henry alone in the flickering light of the fire. The train waited for him, its engine humming softly in the night. Henry climbed back into the cabin, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. What had he just stumbled upon? What was the pendant, and why had the wolves been guarding it? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do now? As the train began to move again, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. The pendant felt heavy in his pocket, its presence a constant reminder of the power he now carried. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. The wolves had chosen him for a reason. And whatever was coming, he would have to face it. The forest blurred past the windows, the snow-covered trees a stark contrast to the darkness of the night. Henry's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more unsettling than the last. He had always believed the world was a simple place, governed by logic and reason. But now he knew better. There were forces at work that defied explanation, forces that had been hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The pendant seemed to pulse in his pocket, its energy a constant reminder of the power he now carried. He could feel it calling to him, urging him to unlock its secrets. But he knew better than to rush into the unknown. The wolves had shown him that much. Whatever the pendant was, it was dangerous. And he would have to tread carefully if he wanted to survive. As the train continued its journey, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The forest seemed to close in around him, its shadows growing darker, more menacing. He could feel the eyes of the wolves on him, even though they were nowhere to be seen. They were still out there, watching, waiting. And they would be there every step of the way. The train's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the tracks ahead. But Henry knew that the Real journey was just beginning. The pendant was just the first piece of a much larger puzzle. And as the train carried him further into the night, he couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the forest was hiding, and what price he would have to pay to uncover them. The hours passed in a blur, the train's rhythmic clattering a constant backdrop to Henry's thoughts. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept drifting back to the pendant. It was as if it had a life of its own, its presence a constant weight on his soul. He could feel its power growing with each passing moment, its energy seeping into his very being. As the train approached the next station, Henry knew he had to make a decision. He couldn't keep the pendant a secret forever. Sooner or later, someone would notice. And when they did, he would have to be ready. But ready for what? He didn't know. All he knew was that the pendant was more than just an object. It was a key to something far greater, far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. The train came to a stop, the station's lights casting a warm glow over the platform. Henry stepped out of the cabin, the pendant heavy in his pocket. He could feel its power radiating through him, a constant reminder of the responsibility he now carried. The wolves had chosen him for a reason, and whatever lay ahead, he would have to face it. As he walked through the station, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows seemed to move on their own, their forms shifting and twisting in the corners of his vision. He could feel the eyes of the wolves on him, their presence a constant weight on his soul. They were still out there, watching, waiting. And they would be there every step of the way. The pendant seemed to pulse in his pocket, its energy a constant reminder of the power he now carried. He could feel it calling to him, urging him to unlock its secrets. But he knew better than to rush into the unknown. The wolves had shown him that much. Whatever the pendant was, it was dangerous, and he would have to tread carefully if he wanted to survive. As Henry stepped out of the station and into the night, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The pendant was just the beginning, and whatever lay ahead, he knew that his life would never be the same. The wolves had chosen him for a reason, and now he would have to face the consequences. The forest loomed in the distance, its shadows stretching out like a dark hand reaching for him. Henry took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. He knew that the Real journey was just beginning. The pendant was just the first piece of a much larger puzzle. And as he stepped into the darkness, he couldn't help but wonder what other secrets the forest was hiding, and what price he would have to pay to uncover them. The pendant seemed to pulse in his pocket, its energy a constant reminder of the power he now carried. He could feel it calling to him, urging him to unlock its secrets. But he knew better than to rush into the unknown. The wolves had shown him that much. Whatever the pendant was, it was dangerous, and he would have to tread carefully if he wanted to survive. As Henry walked into the forest, the shadows closed in around him, their forms shifting and twisting in the corners of his vision. He could feel the eyes of the wolves on him, their presence a constant weight on his soul. They were still out there, watching, waiting. And they would be there every step of the way.